Please, milk. My son. He's dying. The sky was painted with fire. West Texas Lone Mesa. Autumn of 1879. The sun had dipped below the edge of the land like it was hiding from something, and the wind rolled in sharp and dry, whispering through brittle grass. Inside a log cabin pressed against the rim of the mesa, Rachel Garrett crouched by the hearth, sleeves rolled up past her elbows, her husband's old flannel coat heavy on her shoulders. She was coaxing fire from stubborn kindling hands, raw from splitting wood that morning. The room was quiet save the crackle of juniper twigs and her own breath. Since the fever took her son Elijah and her husband rode off soon after, she didn't know where, didn't care anymore. Silence had become something sacred, predictable, safe. Then came the knock. Sharp, fast, desperate. Rachel froze. Her hand drifted to the old rifle leaning near the door. Before she reached it, the knock came again, louder, hurried. A voice followed, cracked by wind and fear. Please, milk. My son. He is dying. Her heart thudded once hard. Then silence. She stepped closer, every breath pulling against old grief and present fear. When she finally unbarred the door, she didn't know what to expect. A thief, a trap. But what stood there wasn't danger. It was something harder. A tall Apache man, eyes dark, jaw, tight hair tied back with rawhide, held a swaddled bundle in his arms. A baby, silent, barely moving. Rachel saw the ribs through the threadbare blanket, lips cracked and dry. The infant was fading before her eyes. Behind the warrior, half hidden in the dying light, stood a huddle of townsfolk, men and women with lanterns and stiff postures, watching, whispering. It's an Apache, someone hissed. Don't let him in, said another. Rachel didn't answer. Her gaze stayed on the child. She stepped forward, voice steady despite the quake in her chest. Give him to me. The man hesitated. Then, without a word, he laid the child in her arms. He did it gently, so gently it made her stomach ache. Inside, the fire finally caught. Rachel sat near it, unbuttoned her dress, and pressed the baby close. His lips fumbled, then latched, weak but hungry. A fragile sound filled the cabin, one she hadn't heard since Elijah. The soft rhythm of a child suckling, and with it the crack of something opening inside her, like old wood under sudden weight. The Apache man stayed near the door, saying nothing. Firelight flickered across the tired lines of his face. A small wound darkened his shirt near the collarbone. You saved him, he said at last, voice low and thick with gratitude. Rachel didn't reply. She only held the child closer, tears sliding down her cheek. What's his name, she asked. Elan Nantan, he said. I am his father, but the baby, we called him Taklashim. He hesitated. We haven't spoken his name since his mother died. Rachel nodded slowly. She looked down at the boy, small-starved, clinging to life with every breath. Her heart clenched. Elijah was gone. But this child was here. Now. Outside, the wind slammed the shutters. Rachel stood baby in arms and walked to the open door. The townsfolk were still there. He's just a baby, she said loud enough for them all to hear. And no child starves on my porch. They said nothing. One by one, the lanterns turned away. That night, Rachel didn't sleep. She sat beside the fire long after the child had drifted off, curled against her chest. She didn't yet know what she had stepped into. She only knew this when that knock came at dusk. Something inside her shifted. Her name might still be Rachel Garrett, but that night she began becoming something else. Maybe a mother again, not of blood, but of choice. Have you ever had a moment like that, when everything changed with just one choice? Let us know where you're watching from. It's always a joy to see how far these old stories can travel. Stick around, because what Elan leaves on her doorstep next, well, it doesn't come wrapped in a blanket. It comes carved in cedar. The child suckled in silence, but the noise outside had not disappeared. It had simply stepped back into the shadows, where judgment often waits its turn. Rachel sat cross-legged near the hearth, her shawl tucked gently over the baby's back, the warmth of his tiny breath brushing her collarbone. Every rise and fall of his chest was a small miracle. Every twitch of his hand, a reminder that someone had almost let him die just because of the color of his father's skin. Elan remained near the door. He hadn't asked to sit, hadn't asked for more than milk. His wound still bled slowly beneath the torn fabric of his tunic, but he didn't flinch. He watched not the fire but the child, his child nursed by a white woman in a town that had already written them both off. Outside, the wind carried voices, still whispering, still watching. Rachel heard them. She's gone soft. She'll regret this. They'll burn her house before winter. She didn't answer the wind. She didn't even turn her head, because for the first time in too long she was doing something that didn't require anyone's approval. Only her heart's. The fire crackled. The child finished letting go with a soft sigh before curling instinctively closer to her chest. Rachel wrapped him tighter, brushed her lips across his damp forehead, and looked up at Elan. "What will you do?" she asked softly. He didn't answer immediately. Then, in a voice lined with miles and grief, he said, "I will come at dawn. Each day. If you'll let me. Until he is strong." Rachel nodded once. It was not permission. It was understanding. She rose slowly, careful not to jostle the child, and stepped toward the door. Elan opened it for her. Outside, the town's eyes still lingered behind shuttered curtains and flickering lamps. Rachel stepped onto the porch, child in arms, shawl drawn high, but not to hide. To shield. "He's just a baby," she said again, this time to the dark. "And no child goes hungry if I have breath in my lungs." No one replied. No rifle lifted. No apology came. But neither did a hand try to take the child. That was enough for now. Elan lingered one more moment before placing something on the porch rail. A leather cord. From it hung a feather red-tailed hawk. Rachel tilted her head in question. "In my tribe," he said, "this means protection. For those who give life." She hesitated, then reached for it. Her fingers brushed his. Warm. Strong. Gentle. She nodded. "I didn't do it for thanks." "I know," he said. "That's why it means more." The wind shifted. Not enough to push the judgment away, but enough to rustle the shutters and remind the town they weren't the only ones watching. Sometimes a town doesn't speak, not because it agrees, but because it doesn't yet know how to face the mirror of its own fear. If you've ever stood up when others stayed quiet, we'd love to know where you found your courage and where you're watching from. Next, Rachel doesn't receive a thank you note. She receives a carved horse that tells her more about Elan's soul than words ever could. The feather sat on the mantel like it had always belonged there. Rachel hadn't planned to keep it at first. It felt sacred, like something meant to be passed back. But each time she touched it, held it in her palm, she felt the pulse of something steady. Not just gratitude, not just survival, but a kind of reverence she hadn't known since Elijah had first wrapped his tiny fingers around hers. Now Nathaniel, yes. That was the name she had whispered to the child, when no one else dared claim him, was cradled in a drawer lined with wool beside the hearth where the warmth never left. His color had returned. His cries were strong. He smiled now, though Rachel wasn't sure if it was gas or dreams. It didn't matter. It was hope either way. Each morning Elan returned with the first light. He never came farther than the porch unless she asked, and every day she did. By the third morning she found something new beside the cradle, a carved horse no bigger than her hand, dark cedar polished smooth. Its legs were tucked mid-gallop, a strip of leather stretched across the back like reins waiting for a rider. On its belly, words carved in quiet devotion, so he will remember his courage always. Rachel held the horse to her chest, the cedar warming against her skin. Elan had left before sunrise, saying nothing of the gift. But it said enough, said everything. That afternoon, when he returned with Nathaniel bundled against the wind, she met him at the door and held out the horse. "You made this," she said. He nodded. "It's beautiful." "It's Apache," he replied. "We carve what we want our children to carry in spirit. This is strength, freedom, memory." Rachel studied the shape of it again, every curve purposeful. Then she stepped aside. "You can come in." Elan hesitated, then crossed the threshold. And in that moment, Rachel Garrett did something the town had whispered she would never do. She invited him in, not just to the cabin, but into something far more dangerous in the eyes of Lone Mesa. She shared her fire. Inside, she poured broth into 2 bowls, pinto beans and venison, chili flakes dried on the windowsill. "You are not what they say," she said quietly. Elan stirred the broth but didn't look up. "I am what the land made me, but I have never hurt your people, not once." Rachel nodded. "I believe you." Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters. Inside, the fire flickered lower drawing shadows across the floorboards. Nathaniel stirred in his wool cradle, one hand wrapped around the cedar horse. Rachel watched him breathe slow and easy. She had crossed the line. Not the one drawn by the town, but the one drawn by fear. Have you ever reached across a boundary someone else said you shouldn't? Left us a little comment, 1 if you've stood where she stood, or 0 if you're still deciding. Either way, your story matters. And if you believe stories like these remind us what courage can look like, share this video with someone who needs a little of it today. Up next, he gives her a son stitched in gold, and she gives him something back he never asked for: trust. The night after Elan crossed the threshold, Rachel couldn't sleep. She sat in her rocking chair, Nathaniel asleep in her arms, the cedar horse tucked between them. The feather still rested on the mantel, casting a soft shadow in the flickering firelight. Elan had gone as he always did, without fanfare. But the air inside the cabin felt different now, not heavier, not lighter, just changed. Like something unspoken had passed between them. Something not yet named, but no longer ignored. That silence held until the next night, when Elan returned again, this time not with the child, but with something small, wrapped in deerskin. He didn't say anything at first, just sat by the hearth while Rachel stirred the stew, her back half turned to him. Nathaniel slept peacefully in the drawer-turned cradle, one hand resting near his mouth. Elan waited for the crackle of the fire to fill the space between them before offering the bundle. Rachel unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a square of linen frayed at the edges, the kind of cloth meant for cradling newborns or wrapping keepsakes. But at its center, stitched in golden thread, was a radiant sun, its rays uneven, slightly crooked, but clearly done with care. My wife Elan said softly, "She made it for our son's naming day, before the soldiers came." Rachel didn't speak. Her fingers hovered over the threads, as if afraid they might unravel at her touch. "She was brave," he continued, eyes distant. "She hid with him when the smoke came. They never made it far. She died protecting him. I found them after. Only this remained." Rachel folded the cloth against her chest, holding it like something living. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Elan gave a slow nod. "In our tribe, we believe the sun carries memory, that it heals what words cannot." She looked up, "And now you carry it." "Sometimes," he said, "I think I carry only the shadow." Rachel stood, slowly moved to sit beside him, their knees nearly touching. She reached across the cradle, across the quiet child between them, and gently placed her hand over his. "You brought him to me," she said. "That was light." Elan looked down at their hands, at the woman who had once stood silent on her porch, as the town cursed her name, now sitting by his side, sharing a fire, a story, a grief. "I thought you might send us away," he admitted. "I nearly did," she replied honestly. "Not because I wanted to, but because I was afraid." He looked up, and now he asked. She exhaled slowly. "Now I am still afraid, but I'm more afraid of doing nothing than of doing the right thing." The fire cracked. Nathaniel shifted in his sleep. Two graves lay between them, one in the red dirt of West Texas, another in the high hills where no settler dared go. But across those graves, something had taken root. Not love, not yet, but the quiet respect that makes love possible. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't grieving a loved one, it's trusting someone else to carry a piece of that grief with you. Have you ever lost someone who changed the way you see the world? We'd be honored if you shared their name in the comments so their story doesn't fade. Next, the town returns with torches and threats, and Rachel has to decide, will she stand alone again, or not at all? The days passed quietly, as they often do before a storm. Rachel fed Nathaniel each morning by the fire, his tiny fingers curling tighter around her shawl with each day that passed. Elan brought cedar for the hearth and water from the spring. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but his presence filled the room in ways no words could. He repaired the shutter that banged in the night. He reinforced the cradle. He carved a spoon small enough for a baby's mouth. And the town watched. They didn't come at first, not with rifles or fists, only whispers. At the general store, in the church pews, on porches where old men rocked slow and suspicious. But whispers grow teeth when they're fed by fear. It was late afternoon when the hooves thundered down the path. Rachel had just finished mashing carrots into a warm paste. Nathaniel giggled, reaching for the spoon. The moment paused in time, and then the knock came. Hard, demanding. The kind that didn't ask, it warned. Rachel opened the door. 6 men stood in her yard. Amos Dillard at the front, shoulders tight with self-righteousness. Caleb Nix beside him, hand resting on the butt of his rifle. Behind them, more familiar faces, neighbors who had once smiled politely. Now their mouths were hard lines. "You're feeding a savage's child," Amos barked. "Harboring him, too. You're forgetting who your people are." Rachel didn't flinch. "I remember who I lost," she said quietly, "and what it means to lose a child. That baby in there is hungry, and no child, Apache or not, deserves to starve." "He's not one of us," Caleb muttered. "You're betraying your kind." Rachel stepped forward, bare feet on the porch boards. "And you," she said, "are forgetting yours." Nathaniel whimpered behind her. The men shifted, uncomfortable under her gaze. Amos growled, "You'll regret this." Rachel folded her arms. "Then I'll regret it feeding a baby. But I won't regret being decent." Silence hung heavy and mean, and then from the road came a second voice, thin but firm. "Let the woman feed the child." All heads turned. Miriam Quinn, widow of the town's first preacher, stepped into view. Gray hair, pulled tight shawl draped heavy over her shoulders. In her arms, a pot wrapped in cloth. "Chicken stew," she said plainly, "with barley and rosemary, for the baby and for the mother." She walked right past the men, placed the pot on the steps, looked Rachel in the eye. "Feed him. That's what mothers do." No one said a word as she turned and walked back down the path. Amos spat in the dirt. "This isn't over." "No," Rachel said. "But it's begun." The men turned. One by one they followed him into the setting sun. Rachel stood there long after they disappeared, Nathaniel now asleep on her chest, his breath warm, steady. She picked up the pot, still warm. Sometimes courage isn't a shout. It's a spoonful of stew left on a step. If you believe that kindness is stronger than fear, press 1 in the comments. If you're still thinking about it, hit 0. We're listening either way. And if this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who needs to remember that standing alone can still change everything. Next, Elan doesn't just return. He takes the rifle off the wall. And Rachel realizes her home is no longer just a cabin, it's a line drawn in the dirt. The next evening, the light felt different. It wasn't just the way the clouds smeared gold across the sky. It was the stillness. The hush before something breaks. Rachel knew it from the way Nathaniel stirred in his sleep, not from hunger, but from something deeper, something ancient. The baby's small hand grasped the air like he could feel the tremor long before it reached the walls. Elan felt it too. He stood near the fire, sharpening the edge of a broken blade. His eyes didn't move, but every breath he took was measured, controlled. Rachel watched him, spoon in hand, barley stew bubbling low. When the first boot struck the dirt outside, she was already at the door. Amos Dillard didn't knock this time. He kicked the door once with the heel of his boot rifle slung over his shoulder, lips curled in the kind of sneer meant to provoke. Behind him stood 4 others, more rifles, more fire, more judgment. "You had your warning," Amos growled. "Now we come to end it." Rachel opened the door slowly. Nathaniel was in her arms, cheek resting against her shoulder. His tiny breath warmed the space between her collar and jaw. Behind her, Elan stepped into view. No weapon, no growl, just presence. "I told you," Amos said, leveling his voice like a blade. "This land doesn't belong to you. That baby don't belong to her. And you," his finger jabbed the air, "you're not even supposed to be alive." Elan took 1 step forward. Calm. Measured. "You do not own this child," he said. "You never will." The men flinched, not at his words, but at the stillness behind them. The kind of stillness that comes from a man who has faced worse than a crowd with guns. A man who doesn't speak out of fear, but out of memory. His father, Elan continued, his voice like the wind against canyon stone. "And she," his gaze turned to Rachel, "she is his mother." Rachel's breath caught. The words hung in the air like smoke. She wasn't sure if Nathaniel understood. But in that moment his hand reached up, brushed her neck, and settled there. "Mother." It was a whisper. A sound too small to silence a crowd, but it did. Amos stepped back. Whether from fear or shame, Rachel couldn't tell, but none of the men moved. Not after that word. Not after the child who shouldn't have had a voice had spoken his truth with one. Finally, Amos muttered, "You'll regret this." Rachel stood taller. "No. I'll remember this. That's what mothers do." He turned. They left, and Elan stepped forward. Not to claim, not to shield, just to be there. With her, with him. Some names are given, others are earned, and sometimes the smallest voice carries the strongest truth. If you believe being a parent isn't about blood, but about who stays, tell us with a 1 in the comments, or a 0 if you're still thinking about what love really means. And if you've ever stood between someone you love and the fire, share this story with them. Next, moonlight, a cradle, and a carving in the wood. Rachel picks up the knife not to defend, but to remember. The fire burned low. The night had stretched quiet again, at least on the surface. After the men left, after the door was shut, and the lantern dimmed, Rachel stood alone beneath the thick beam above the hearth. Nathaniel cradled against her chest. The boy had drifted into sleep, his thumb curled near his mouth, the carved cedar horse still tucked close beside him. Elan sat by the hearth, still as stone. But Rachel could see it, the way he pressed his palm to his thigh, the way sweat had beaded near his temple, despite the cold creeping in. The wound was fresh. The limp he tried to hide had deepened since sunset. But he said nothing. So she did what she could. First for the child, then for the man. She reached for the carving knife, the same one Elan had used to shape Nathaniel's cradle, and pressed its tip gently into the wooden beam. Her free hand guided the blade, slow, steady. Nathaniel. Letter by letter the name took form. She whispered each one as if giving it breath, and when it was done she stepped back and stared. "There," she murmured, "now the walls will remember too." Behind her a soft groan. She turned. Elan had leaned too far forward, pain breaking through his silence. The blood on his pant leg had grown darker, thicker. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked, rushing to him. "I needed to be standing," he said through clenched teeth. "If they came again." Rachel was already at the basin, boiling water, pulling down the bundle of clean cloth she'd prepared for nights just like this, though never like this. She knelt beside him. The cut was bad. Torn skin across his thigh, angry and swollen. A kick from a deer. A risk he'd taken alone so there'd be meat for winter. "You should have waited," she whispered, wiping away dried blood. "I couldn't." "You should have let me go instead." "I've hunted since I could walk," he said. "The deer wouldn't have waited." She gave a soft, breathless laugh. "Stubborn man." He didn't answer, but something in his face softened. Rachel worked quietly, hands steady despite the weight in her chest. She dressed the wound, packed it clean, and wrapped it with firm care. Then she pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. He didn't flinch. Instead, he whispered, "You carved his name." "I did." He looked past her toward the beam. "So he won't forget who claimed him first." Rachel nodded. "And so I won't forget what it cost to choose him." Their eyes met. Not all bloodshed comes from battle. Sometimes it seeps from silence when we try to carry more than we were meant to alone. Have you ever kept going when you should have asked for help? Leave a 1 if you've been there. Leave a 0 if you're still learning how. And if someone ever stood strong for your sake, tag them or share this story with them. Let them know their strength wasn't invisible. Next, moonlight. A fire circle. and a question spoken without claim but full of promise. It began with a warning, soft, breathless, and laced with fear. Miriam Quinn had come just before sunset, skirts muddied bonnet in hand. Her voice shook as she stepped into Rachel's kitchen, glancing over her shoulder, like even the wind could carry rumors. "They're coming tonight," she said. "Amos, he's gathered men. They're not just angry this time. They're armed." Rachel didn't flinch. She just pressed her hand gently against Nathaniel's back, the child asleep in her sling, heartbeat steady and trusting. Elan stood by the window, his wound still healing, but his posture solid. "We go to the trees," he said. "Now." Within minutes, Rachel packed what they needed, blankets, bread, a flask of water. Elan wrapped Nathaniel's cradle into a leather sling and hoisted it across his shoulders like a sacred burden. No words were needed, only movement. They left the cabin behind just as the sky turned indigo. The forest was quiet save for the rustle of leaves and the low cry of an owl somewhere deeper in the pines. They followed an old trail toward the creek bed, Elan leading Rachel close behind. Nathaniel curled in her warmth, but even the shadows couldn't hide the glint of metal waiting for them. Just beyond the water lanterns bobbed like fireflies gone angry. Amos and his men, dozens now, standing in a half-moon along the bank, rifles slung, triggers waiting. Rachel froze. Elan's arm reached back instinctively, shielding her. Then came the shout. "Step forward and face the law," Amos's voice, twisted with triumph. Rachel's heart slammed. The trap had been laid too well. And then before Elan could raise his rifle, before Rachel could speak, another shot echoed. Not from the line of men, from behind them. Lanterns flared, boots shifted, and from the edge of the hill emerged a tall figure with a preacher's collar and a federal badge glinting on his chest. Reverend Jonas Clay, and beside him, Sheriff Valid of the U.S. Marshal Service. "This family is protected." The sheriff's voice cut clean through the tension. "Any man who raises a weapon tonight raises it against the United States." The silence shattered. Amos sputtered. "You've got no right." "I've got the law," the sheriff said, lifting a sealed document. "And I've got sworn testimony from a witness who saw what was done to that woman, what she ran from, what she survived." Miriam stepped forward then, her chin high. "She told the truth," she said, "all those months ago. I saw it. And I stayed silent. Not anymore." The crowd shifted. Some men lowered their guns. Rachel stood taller, arms curled around Nathaniel, who stirred gently at her chest. Elan didn't move. His gaze locked with Amos's. No fear, just resolve. Amos spat. "We'll remember this." Rachel spoke softly. "So will we." And slowly the men turned. Lanterns bobbing again, but this time in retreat. The seasons turned over Lone Mesa as quietly as a page being turned in a well-worn book. Spring crept in on tiptoe, softening the earth, coaxing green from stubborn roots. Where silence had once reigned, now there were echoes of new sounds, a baby's giggle, the clatter of small feet, the creak of a schoolhouse door, or rather a smokehouse. The old timber structure had stood behind Rachel's cabin since before the war, blackened walls, a rusted iron hook hanging from the center beam. Elan had stared at it for days before quietly suggesting, "We can make it something else." And so they had. Together they cleaned the soot, scrubbed the wood-carved benches from pine planks. Miriam donated a chalk slate and the town blacksmith hammered nails for a coat rack. Rachel stitched a curtain from flour sacks while Elan built a tiny porch with his own hands. By the first summer sun, 6 children came. Apache, settler, 2 from the orphaned Blakely family, 1 shy boy with a stammer, and Nathaniel, who toddled around the edges, still too young for letters but never far from the lessons. They called her Miss Rachel, though some simply called her Ma'am. And there, in that smoke-scented room with sunbeams slanting through old chinks in the wall, Rachel Garrett taught the children of Lone Mesa not just how to read, but how to see. She taught letters, yes, how to draw A like a teepee and M like mountains. But she also taught stories of different peoples, of planting cycles, and river fish of stars that Apache children followed, and hymns settlers sang at dusk. Sometimes Elan would step in standing silently at the back of the room until one brave child asked, "What does that mark mean?" pointing to the etchings on his belt. And Elan would kneel, voice low and firm, teaching them not just words, but meaning. No, he'd say gently, "This doesn't mean war. It means begin again." And somehow in that old building where meat had once hung, now hung hope. Of course not everyone approved. There were still whispers in town about mixing bloodlines, about forgotten places turning into sanctuaries. But no one dared confront Rachel anymore, not after Amos left, not after the sheriff's warning, not after the name Nathaniel was carved into the beam above her hearth. Instead, the town began to change. Slowly, the shopkeeper's son began leaving flowers on the porch step. The preacher's widow donated hymnals even if the children just used them to practice writing. And one morning, as Rachel poured coffee into her tin mug, she heard it the sound of children laughing together. Loud, free, real. She stepped out onto the porch and saw them playing beside the smokehouse, tossing petals from wildflowers. Nathaniel chasing the older boys with his carved wooden horse. Elan leaned against the fence, arms folded, eyes soft. "You did this," she said. He shook his head. "We did." She reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. The lanterns hung from the trees like stars that had decided to rest closer to the earth that night. Sage and wildflowers were woven into garlands draped across the wooden arch Elan had built with the same hands he once used to craft weapons, and now cradles and benches. The fire circle behind the cabin glowed with a gentle warmth, not roaring, not demanding, but alive. Just enough to hold the night steady. There were no invitations, but people came. Miriam Quinn, in her best apron hair pulled back with a silver comb she hadn't worn since her wedding 40 years ago. The blacksmith with a bottle of blackberry cordial. The Blakely children in mended shoes, faces scrubbed clean. And Nathaniel with a ribbon in his curls clutching the carved cedar horse Elan had given him. Rachel wore a dress sewn by women from both sides of the ridge, Apache beadwork stitched across settler muslin. Her hair, untamed and woven with sprigs of mountain lavender, fell freely around her shoulders. And around her neck, still warm from her skin, hung the necklace Elan had given her, the white corn kernel resting above her heart. She didn't wear shoes. She didn't need to. Beside the fire, Elan waited. He didn't hold flowers or a Bible. He held her gaze. And when Rachel stepped into the circle, the world quieted. There were no vows, no preacher's sermon, no long declarations. Just hands joined hers, calloused from washing, chopping, cradling. His rough with wood and healing. And a silence that said everything that needed saying. Elan leaned in, his voice low but steady. "You speak with your heart, Rachel. And today I ask for nothing except to walk beside it." Rachel's breath caught in her throat, not from nerves, but from recognition. That this was not the beginning of something, it was the naming of what had already begun. Long before this fire. Long before the ribbon in Nathaniel's hair. "I am already home," she whispered. And when they kissed, it wasn't for show. It wasn't to seal something. It was because the fire within them had already been burning, and now the whole mesa could see its light. Later, when the guests had left, and Nathaniel was curled beneath the quilt stitched with Elan's mother's sun embroidery, Rachel and Elan stood inside the quiet of their cabin. The lantern was low. The wind whispered against the walls. Elan walked to the beam above the hearth, the same place where Rachel had once carved Nathaniel's name, and with his carving knife he etched 2 more letters beside it. R, and then E. Rachel stepped closer, laying her palm over the grooves. "No vows needed," she said, smiling. No, Elan replied. "Just names. Names that the wood will carry longer than we ever could." She looked up at him. "So, this is it. This is home," he answered. Sometimes the deepest promises are the ones whispered in the silence between breaths, carved not in gold, but in wood by firelight, beside the ones who stayed. If this story found you tonight, if it made your heart beat slower, steadier, let us know. Press 1 if you've ever found home in a person, or 0 if you're still searching and holding on to hope. And if you believe love doesn't need fanfare, only truth, trust, and time share this story. Someone out there may be waiting to feel seen. Subscribe to Wild West Stories channel for more tales just like this, where dust and distance cannot drown out devotion, and where sometimes all it takes is one knock on the door to begin again.